Okay, Mr. Kelleher, thank you for agreeing to interview for this project. It's a project of the Senior Lawyers Division, yes, I am one, of the State Bar. And I understand that you have, at some point in the past, you gave an interview that you think is connected to this project?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Do you kind of remember when that might have been?
It was with Bob Simon at his home at the corner of 15th Street and Park Avenue.
But 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, maybe?
Maybe 5, 10 years ago.
Okay. Well, I want to really kind of interview you as, you know, one of the stellar senior lawyers in the state now, but I also want to get more information that nobody has except people who know you and your family about the history of the Kelleher family in law in New Mexico, because it's one of the, it is a premier law firm and one of the very oldest.
Thank you.
So would you talk just a little bit, just you know, as if I didn't know any of this, tell me about your father, William A. Kelleher, where he came from, how he came to be here.
Well, my father was brought here when he was 2 years old. He was born in Lawrence, Kansas. However, his parents were actually married here September 25, 1882 at the San Felipe Church. They were residing here at the time when they met and married, later went to Los Angeles, and then my grandfather's mother got sick. They went back to Lawrence, and that's where my dad was born. They brought him here when he was 2 years old.
Where'd they first live?
They lived at the 301 West Baca. That's in the Borealis area. My grandfather was employed by the Santa Fe Railroad. It was a rent house. The name of Baca is now Santa Fe, New Mexico, Santa Fe Street. They later moved, they owned a home at 323 West Atlantic, which is at the corner of 4th and Atlantic. And then my dad, after my grandfather died, bought a lot and built a house at 501 West Fruit.
Well, was he married to your mom at that time?
Oh, no. My father was married. His first wife died when my sister Marianne was 8 weeks old.
Yes.
And then he later married my mother in 1932. My
Well,
mother was teaching at the University of New Mexico at the time.
tell me what you know of your father's education and his choice to enter the practice of law.
My father took the examinations for the 8th grade, but he had to go to work because his father was sick. So he never went to high school, he never went to college. He went to work as a Western Union delivery boy, later a telegraph operator. He had several jobs, became a reporter for the Albuquerque Journal, later city editor for the Albuquerque Journal. He applied as a special student to go to Washington and Lee University at Lexington, Virginia. Washington and Lee had a policy that was started by General Robert E. Lee after the Civil War, the war between the states, depending on whether you're Southern or Northerner, that there were a lot of men that had been in the military that had no education, and he thought that they should let people in even without education, formal education. As I say, Dad had been a reporter for both the evening newspaper and the morning newspaper, city editor of the Journal, and he could write and was very well read, and he applied, was accepted, borrowed the money, went to law school intending to practice law after first year, but the fellow that lent the money to him was P.F. McCanna. He encouraged him to go back and get a degree. He said it was very important to have the degree.
Was it called a JD at that time?
Was what?
A law degree called a JD, or?
No, it was called a Bachelor of Laws.
Okay.
Bachelor of Laws was what was normally awarded to anyone that went to law school.
Correct. Okay. So he did that in 3 years?
2 years.
2 years.
2-year course.
And came back.
Came back and opened the practice of law.
I remember, Mr. Kelleher, you telling a story some long time ago that the way I'm recalling it, your dad was just hung out a shingle and kind of waiting for people to need him. And he had a case involving someone accused of some kind of nefarious conduct out in Sandoval County. And if you're remembering the story, people were still on horseback, and then when he comes up to the courthouse with his client, is this right?
Well, I do recall him telling one story about defending a murder on a murder charge in Bernalillo, New Mexico, Sandoval County, and the defendant asked who all these people were.
This is the story.
And they said that they're witnesses. Well, he says that I better get my witnesses. Dad said, "You have witnesses? You didn't tell me that." Yes. So he said, "Well, I'll go get my witnesses." Dad thought he'd step out and get his witnesses. The guy left the courthouse, got on his horse, and went toward Cuba. They never saw him again.
That's the story I remember. So if he was defending a guy in a murder case, I take it he was basically doing any work that came up in his
That's the way all lawyers did at the time. As did we.
Oh, really? When you, but you never, you and your brothers and the others in the Keller firm, you never did criminal defense, I don't.
We did not do criminal defense, but when I started to practice law, there was no public defender.
Oh, that's right.
You had all of the criminal defense work was pro bono. You were appointed by the court. The Bernalillo County, the Second Judicial District, at least for the Albuquerque lawyers, we were on a list. I was told it was a 5-year list, and the judges would appoint you to defend somebody. The federal court, you were on the list for about a year. And in the federal court, it was almost every Friday morning. You would be asked about Wednesday morning by the clerk of the court. William Briers would call and say, "Judge Carl Hatch would like to know if you could be in court on Friday morning." And of course, we were expecting the call, and we were in court on Friday morning for arraignments and assignment.
And you take that client all the way through trial or resolution?
But many of them were Dwyer Act cases, motor vehicles that were being transported in interstate commerce that did not belong to the driver, stolen motor vehicles crossing the state line. J. Edgar Hoover was big on that. But I was appointed in one case by Judge Robert Reedy to defend a first-degree murder trial with today, I was probably out of law school 3 or 4 years.
Oh, gosh.
And I was the sole person. I remember Pete Domenici had a murder case I think that he did try, but we were just appointed.
Did you try that case?
No,
or
I pled him guilty. I pled him guilty because he'd been in the insane asylum at Las Vegas. He'd been in the penitentiary, and I had him examined by a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said he was not insane, although he'd strangled a woman. He was in a halfway house and strangled a woman, just choked her to death. And I asked him, I said, "You're going to either go back to the penitentiary or the insane asylum. Would you have a preference?" And he said, "Definitely, I want to go to the penitentiary." And I asked him why, and he said, "The movies are much better at the penitentiary." So I thought that was a reasonable.
You've got to have some criteria. So you did not develop a taste for criminal law, I take it?
Well, I didn't. No, I was busy in civil matters.
Yeah. Well, tell me, I'm going to step back again to your father beginning to practice law. There came a time when he became general counsel for a public service company of New Mexico?
Yes.
And didn't, if I understand this right, that was kind of the cornerstone business on which the firm began to build?
No. He as I mentioned a moment ago, P.F. McCann had lent him the money to go to law school. P.F. McCann had a real estate and insurance agency, and he represented a number of insurance companies, USF&G, St. Paul Home Insurance Company, and he would recommend my father to defend insurance companies. So he did a lot of trial work, a lot of insurance company defense work, personal injury defense work. He also represented Greyhound bus company in a major case when a bus crossed the railroad tracks down near Isoleta and was hit by a train. And that was a big case for Dad. I remember that case. But in 1935, he was asked by the then lawyer for Albuquerque Gas and Electric, who was going on vacation, to please watch his desk if anything came in for the, it was a combination utility, Albuquerque Gas and Electric. And unfortunately, the lawyer that he was asked to watch the desk had a heart attack in Missouri and died.
And who was that? Do you remember?
His name was Raymond Ryan. He was at one point a lawyer in Silver City, then he was on the New Mexico Supreme Court, and then he came back to Albuquerque and was practicing law.
So that, your dad covered that desk for decades?
He became, well, Albuquerque Gas and Electric later in 1917. No, Albuquerque Gas and Electric was chartered in 1917. In 1947, the then owners of the Albuquerque Gas and Electric, which was Federal Light and Traction, which was owned by City Services, because of the 1935 Public Utility Holding Company Act, the federal government, Congress passed a law that required these utilities to, that were holding companies, to be divested. So they merged the Santa Fe utility, the Albuquerque utility, the Las Vegas utility, and the Deming utility into one company, and it was the surviving company was Albuquerque Gas and Electric. That merger occurred in 1947, and the name of the Albuquerque Gas and Electric was changed to Public Service Company New Mexico. And the charter that was used was the Charter of Albuquerque Gas and Electric. That's why it's dated to 1917.
Well, you became a national expert in public utilities.
Well, I wasn't a national expert, I wouldn't say that.
Well,
But I became later, I did become general counsel of Public Service Company about 1969, although I was a partner in the Kelleher and McLeod law firm. Public Service Company did not have an in-house legal department until about 1991.
So that would be during the 70s and 80s. You were their general counsel, and I'm of the impression that your entire practice was utility work.
Not my entire practice, no. I always kept a few other clients. And we had several lawyers in the office that did utility work.
Okay, all right. Well, you then had a...
It dominated my practice, but it was not all of my practice.
And I'm guessing that the practice in the area of law in public utilities developed mostly during your dad's and your tenure, because except for water systems, there weren't public utilities.
Well, until 1941, there was no New Mexico Public Service Commission. Prior to that time, the cities would regulate the electric gas utilities. The cities were, it was generally thought throughout the United States, the cities didn't have the resources to regulate. So they passed the New Mexico Public Utility Act in 1941, and the gas and electric utilities came under the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission. All the telephone companies, the railroads, the Western Union, telegraph companies were under the State Corporation Commission, because that was in the New Mexico Constitution.
Well, I'm just going to have to take a break here and think about that. So your dad, did he continue, would you say, how long did he actively practice before did he slow it down at all, or did he retire altogether?
Well, he began about 1955. He was working half days. At that time, he was born in 1886. So at that time, he was 65, almost 70 years old. But he wanted to write history, and he was spending his afternoons writing history.
Well, I wanted to get this perspective on him on record, because you have you're the oldest of 4 boys.
Yes.
And over time, all 4 of you became lawyers.
No, 3 of us did.
John never became a lawyer?
John never became a lawyer.
The 3 of you, though, joined with the Kelleher firm.
Yes.
It's almost self-evident to ask you this question, but how much of an influence in your decision to become a lawyer was your dad?
I always wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I always wanted to be a lawyer. I recall going to Taos with him when I was about 5 years old. He was going to argue a case, or going to argue a motion. I don't know what he was doing. I sat in the courtroom, and I was probably reading a book and not paying attention. But I was with my dad then. We talked about the law. I worked in the law office after my freshman year in college. I attended depositions, attended cases. I just knew I wanted to be a lawyer. There was never any doubt about it.
Even as a boy, as a high school age student?
Oh no, grade school.
Yeah. And you've also told me that your dad was very interested in capturing the stories that were going to die with people that pertain to New Mexico history while you were quite young. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, my father said that when he was an Albuquerque newspaper reporter, he began to notice that people were dying off that were part of the history of Albuquerque, the history of New Mexico, territorial days, and he would keep a file on those people. And he would, he knew them, keep a file on them.
Did he have conversations that were essentially interviews, or?
I don't know about that, but I know that he told me he kept files on people. All of those papers, after my mother died in 2000, Dad died in 1972, Mother died in 2000, and we gave them all to the University of New Mexico, which has substantially all of them. I still have a few files that I never screened. I screened all of the papers that were in the basement of our house. We had a large basement with files, and I went through every paper to make sure that there was, well, he, after he became half day, he would have a secretary come out to the office, to the house. He would, she would bring any letters that had come in, but she also wrote letters on his behalf when he was doing historical research. He would write letters to people trying to verify dates, facts, relationships.
Nice. Did you not drive around with him and actually interview people, or was it more in the nature of
Never
looking
did
at?
that. My brother Michael, actually, who's a little more than a year younger than I did, I think Michael, well, Michael actually went around with him more. I recall going to Carrizoso, New Mexico, with him when I was in grade school. He went to the courthouse down there. We went to White Oaks. We interviewed somebody. He interviewed an old resident of White Oaks, New Mexico. White Oaks is an old gold mining town.
So this was what, probably some of the germination of the Lincoln County, the book.
He was working probably on violence in Lincoln County, which was published in 1957.
And it's still a terrific book.
Yes. It had a lot of footnotes. Turmoil in New Mexico was published before that. I mean, his books, Turmoil and Violence, have a lot of footnotes.
And that continued to be a compelling interest for him as long as he was
working on a sixth book when he died.
What was the subject matter on that?
San Juan, the history of San Juan, northwestern New Mexico.
That wasn't finished enough to...
It wasn't finished. Michael Kelleher has the manuscript. I thought the manuscript had been lost, but Michael, several years ago, told me he had it.
So as to your professional career here, you did retain a few private clients.
I did probate. Dad had an extensive made a lot of wills and trusts, probate. I became a member of the American College of Trust and Estate Council in the 1969 or so.
So you did
Always
just-
kept that up. It's a premier organization, which because later when I became so involved in public service company work, I could never have qualified for the to become a member of well, it was originally called the American Probate Lawyers, but later American College of Trust and Estate Council.
Am I right that your brother Michael Kelleher specialized in the area of probate and trust work?
He did a lot of work in that area, but he also represented a number of other clients.
And what about your brother Thomas Kelleher? What was
Thomas
his practice?
Kelleher was, he became a member of the bar after Dad died. He had been in the Navy, he'd been a Seabee. He and my brother John were in the construction company business. He was a registered professional engineer, and then he became a lawyer and he representing contractors, construction defects, that sort of thing, litigation involving commercial construction projects.
And your wife, Jan Reeves Kelleher, did you meet her as an undergraduate?
Yeah, she was a freshman at UNM when I was a senior.
And talk about the relationship between her father and your family's business, what he did, and what was he not the general manager? No.
He worked for Public Service Company in New Mexico.
Wasn't he the general manager at some point?
Well, he was president.
The president of the company. Now, what were this, if you remember the span of years that Dick Reeves was the president of PNM?
I think George Schreiber had become president when I became general counsel. George Schreiber followed. It was Arthur Prager was the first president. Dick Reeves was the second. George Schreiber was the third.
So when you married Jan Reeves, was Dick Reeves still the president of PNM?
I think he was, but I went into the Air Force and I was
That's right.
a JAG officer in the Air Force.
What were your years of service in the Air
58 to
Force?
60.
All right. Can you tell us where you were stationed?
Stationed at Newburgh, well, stationed at Stewart Air Force Base. The nearby town was Newburgh, although there were other small towns around it. We actually lived in Newburgh.
And that leads me to think of your daughter Mary Kelleher. You have 5 children.
Yes,
And 3 of them are attorneys?
3.
Okay.
Three have members of the state bar. Yes.
Right.
Mary was born in the Air Force when I was in the Air Force in Newburgh.
And she is married to an attorney, Bruce
Yes.
Castle. Okay. And they have sort of a private practice that involves
Yes.
the 2 of them. And how about your son, Bill Kelleher?
He was Mary was initially with the Rhodey Law Firm. Then they adopted a child, and she was asked to, by the adoption agency, that she would have to take a 6-month leave of absence, which she did, and then she decided not to return, and later is in private practice after many years. Bill was in the Modwell firm for many years, and he's with Tom Smith and a couple others.
And your daughter Joanne practiced briefly and then did more regulatory kind of stuff?
Well, then she went to work for a consulting engineering firm.
There you go. Okay, so you've got those 5 kids. How many grandchildren?
10 grandchildren.
10 grandchildren. Nobody's a lawyer yet.
No.
No.
No prospects
You're
yet.
not seeing that. Talk about your life outside of the law firm, say when you were a young lawyer and had a young family. What other activities did you engage in?
Well, I was on several minor boards. Mostly they wanted you to raise money for that board. I got involved. I was known I supported Pete Domenici when he ran for the city commission. I later was co-chair of his finance committee in 1984, I believe. I was later chairman of his last 2 campaigns for re-election, and then I was going to be the chairman when he was going to run for his 6th term. That's when he decided to step aside, and he was not. He didn't run for re-election.
Well, I happen to know this because of our families and personal relationship, but you were a pretty serious hiker. I mean, I recall those children stomping up and down a lot of mountains.
Not serious hiker. By the standards of a lot of hikers, no. We did hike in the mountains, took the children.
But you never became, your father-in-law was an avid fly fisherman.
Yes.
You never got, I hate to say it, hooked.
No, I did it, but I was never particularly enthusiastic.
Yeah.
You asked about the other things that I did. I was on the board of trustees of the Vias Caldera Trust.
Oh, I did not know that. Yeah.
Which was a wonderful opportunity to work with that, although today it's a unit of the National Park Service.
And what was the trust established for?
To run the Vias
To manage it, after it was already a preserve?
When the United States government bought it for $100 million, the idea was it would become financially self-supporting, but it really couldn't become financially self-supporting because of the high altitude, the distance from the lack of facilities, the lack of infrastructure, just didn't work.
Yeah. Well, as a preservationist, I think that worked out just terrific.
Yeah.
I guess you would agree on that.
Yes.
Well, let's just range over. I have a sense that the practice of law during your father's tenure changed slowly, but there was still what has been described in warm terms by more senior lawyers as more of a collegial practice among the bar. The bar was small, and it really was reasonably small when he stepped back from active practice.
It was reasonably small when I practiced law. When I took the New Mexico State Bar exam, I graduated from Stanford Law School in January of 1958, took the February bar. The bar exam was on a Monday and Tuesday. We were told that the grades would be posted at 4 p.m. on the front door of the Supreme Court chambers. And if we showed up at 4 o'clock, we could look at the list, and we went and looked at the list. You don't get those quick results. Of course, there was no national bar. We had no numbers. I was later assigned a bar number. For years, I didn't have a bar number. We didn't need IDs. There was no security at the courthouse, at the federal courthouse. If you wanted to go see a federal judge, you just went up and went to see the federal judge or the U.S. Attorney, District Attorney's office. Just showed up.
Well, I had heard of, it could have been you, but it might have been one of the elder lawyers in the model firm talking about a case. And the only thing I remember about it is that after the jury came in, the opposing counsel said, "You won fair and square, there's not going to be an appeal." And that stunned me. There just wasn't that tenor anymore.
Well, I never heard that, but I will say this about jury cases. I have one case I tried with Russell Moore, but Russell was senior to me in the office, and he was a great, absolutely superb trial lawyer. He's dead now. But I was younger, but he was with me. The other one, I don't think there was another lawyer with me, but we would try smaller cases that you don't do today. We impaneled the jury, opening statements, had the case all day long, submitted to the jury, and the jury came in before dinner. And you tried 2 cases in one day.
And that was typical.
There were 2 different civil cases. I said one day, but different, probably months apart. But you simply don't have one-day jury trials today.
When did the state develop uniform jury instructions?
I don't know, but we didn't have them when I started.
Did you make them up? I mean, did you work on them, or did
No,
the judge?
I didn't know.
The judge just did the instructions?
I don't know how. I mean, I was on the state bar committee when the Uniform Probate Code was under consideration, and a number of probate lawyers worked on the Uniform Probate Code to adapt it to New Mexico because we had a couple of problems. One, the probate court is a constitutionally created court, and the rural counties, it was felt, would object strenuously to amending the Constitution to get rid of it. And then we have the community property law that we had to adapt the Uniform Probate Code to that.
Thinking back, just without me directing you specifically with a question, but I guess I just want to ask you how you saw the practice of law change.
Well, the
over your
regulatory
practice.
requirements, first of all, when Public Service Company of New Mexico was a participant in the units 4 and 5 at the Four Corners Power Plant, and then Public Service Company and Tucson Electric Power Company built the San Juan Power Plant, which is 9 miles north of Four Corners. The National Environmental Policy Act was passed in 1969. Ground was broken for that plant in 1969. There was just no real regulatory criteria. You had the Air Quality Control Acts passed. The Environmental Improvement Departments created or had jurisdiction over air quality. The Surface Mining Acts were passed. We had to get permits to mine the coal, the strip mine. Then we had the Nuclear Regulatory Commission when Public Service Committee participated in the nuclear power plant at Palo Verde, 70 miles west of Phoenix. So there was just all sorts of regulations that came in. You have the Americans with Disabilities Act. You have all sorts of regulations.
The whole panoply of employment laws developed after the 60s. Yeah. So there's much more of an administrative law practice in some ways.
Much more.
And how about generally in the bar in New Mexico? You've been active in the bar to some extent most of your career. You've served on committees.
Well, I haven't been really active. I mean, many lawyers have been far more active than I have. And I mean, I've been mentioned the probate, but I haven't been I haven't been an active member of the bar. I get my CLE.
Yes. What are you doing now in terms of practice? Are you still handling some cases, or?
Well, I'm doing a few probates and real estate, but not much. I try to get in by 10 o'clock in the morning and leave by 3 or 4.
Which is practically much less than half time.
Oh, much less, yeah. Yeah, and I do pro bono stuff.
Any archdiocese or
No.
charitable activities, or? No,
Well,
this is not practice questions. This is other things that you personally have been involved in or are now.
I've never been involved in any of really archdiocese stuff. My brother Michael has, but I haven't.
Did you know that if you drive down Lomas on a late Saturday afternoon, your brother Michael can be seen out there sweeping the sidewalk in front of Our Lady of Fatima?
I doubt that.
I've seen him do it.
I doubt that, seriously. I'd have to get a second opinion.
I think you'd have to ask him, or just drive up and down Lomas, see if that happens. What would you say about the practice of law in New Mexico now? And by now, I don't mean today. I mean the last 10 years or 15 years, 20 years.
Well, I have practiced law with a very narrow set of, opposing counsels. Most of the people that I deal with, I know.
Yes.
With very few exceptions. They're all fine lawyers. Unfortunately, the economy of New Mexico is not good. I think that growth is yet to be seen. I think had I gone to work for a law firm in Dallas or Denver or Phoenix, it would have been much bigger. We just haven't grown. The economy is not good.
Well, thinking about the younger lawyers, you mentored quite a few in your career. Is that a fair statement?
Well, yes.
And it seems to me that the just based on my shorter career, but I am a senior lawyer, younger lawyers, at least in the era when I came in and then your children came in, this is where I was going to work. Or I might go in-house, but they expected to hunker down and work in this firm or in this practice. And that expectation seems to have changed almost entirely. Has that been your observation?
How has it changed?
Well, it's not my interview, but I think that, yeah, well, one thing I know is that many younger lawyers come in with massive student debt, and that influences whether they stay where they are, they go to another geographic area where they can make more money. But I guess I would say generally, not as many younger lawyers find the practice of law satisfying, and I know that you and your brothers and people I know in my family and otherwise found it quite satisfying as a career.
I think that many of the lawyers of my generation, we were more general practitioners. We did a lot of different things. Now, if you're with a law firm and you begin to work with an older lawyer, you become more focused more quickly. You don't have the breadth of diversity in your practice. But I mean, I think that's true in Albuquerque, but certainly if you're practicing in Las Vegas, New Mexico, or Deming, or Farmington, I think you're going to have to do a whole lot of broader.
Well, I'm reading into that you're saying that made the practice of law necessarily a little more interesting.
Well, I found it very interesting. I have always I will attend almost any CLE to get my credits hours if it's a convenient time to go. I just like to know what's going on.
What is your opinion generally, or what kinds of thoughts do you have about litigation as a way of resolving disputes?
Well, today you have pretrial conferences, you have a pretrial order, you have all this procedure. We didn't have any of that. We didn't have any of that in the state court, and my recollection is we didn't have them in federal court until I had one case. It was a Miller Act case, and Judge Carl Hatch was blind, Judge Rogers was sick. They sent a Judge Sherman Christensen down here from Salt Lake City, and boy, he ran a type ship on pretrial orders, scheduling. It was a shock to me.
First time you'd seen that?
Yes.
Oh, and when you're talking about the days where you would try a jury trial in a day, or perhaps two, what would you say, ballpark, would be the average time from inception of case to getting the case to trial?
Well, I don't have a good handle on that. I wouldn't want to answer that.
It wasn't the 18 months, 2-year kind of.
I just don't recall.
Backlog we see now.
I don't recall. I recall getting settings with, going over to get on a non-jury case, needing a setting and going into the judge's secretary and looking at the book with her and saying, well, right here, what about this time? Okay, she said, Bill, I'll give it to you. I just lobbied for my settings.
See, those kind of little anecdotes are what I'm really seeking to take out of these interviews. People won't, it's like your dad and the historical stories, people won't remember that it was like that.
I just, and then asking the judge for a temporary restraining order. I remember one day going to filing the lawsuit needing a temporary restraining order. And Judge Reedy, he said, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to get mixed up in this. And I said, may I go to another judge, because it's totally improper to go to another judge if you've been turned down by one judge. And he said, go ahead. So I went to another judge, and same result. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to give me a temporary restraining order. I asked him if I could go to another judge. He said yes. I went to Judge John McManus, and McManus said, I'll do it. And so, but he knew that I'd been to 2 other judges and turned down. you know, my credibility would have been severely impaired if I'd not told him I'd been someplace else. But McManus said, sure. There were only 5 judges for the Bernalillo, Valencia, and Sandoval County. Those 3 counties had 5 judges. Finally, they lobbied for a 6th judge, and the legislature required that the 6th judge have his principal office in Los Lunas, New Mexico, at the Valencia County courthouse. Judge Paul Larazola was assigned, or he was selected by the governor, appointed, and I remember that he didn't have much business down in Los Lunas, but he did have his stationery, and it said Paul Larazola, principal office, Los Lunas, New Mexico. But you could always find him in the Bernalillo County District Courthouse.
And what about, well, Sandoval got their own judges when?
Well, then they split. The 2nd Judicial District was changed, and we lost Valencia and Sandoval County, and that became the 13th Judicial District, even though one's to the north of Bernalillo County and one's to the south.
What do you recall about, I'm going to ask you about some of the lawyers of, well, closer to your dad's vintage, but older than you, that you, I'm sure, would have worked with. What do you remember about Dick Modrell?
He was a absolutely superb gentleman. He was a very capable lawyer. I knew Mr. Modrell. He was on the 8th floor of the public service. The Modrell firm was on the 8th floor of the public service building. We were on the 9th floor. I can recall Mr. Modrell asking me to be signing orders, guardian ad litem orders or something in a probate, and I just sign off. If Mr. Modrell asked me to sign off, I signed off. I knew it was right. Later, there was a New Mexico Supreme Court case where a lawyer had signed off on a guardian ad litem, and he got hit with a very substantial judgment.
I do recall that case.
But with Mr. Modrell asked me to do something, I did it.
And how about, I'm thinking about the more senior members of the Rohde firm.
The Rohde firm lawyers? I was Don Dickinson.
Okay. Rohde Sloanig, okay, yeah.
Bill Sloan.
And what were your interactions, your memories of
well,
working with those gentlemen?
Don Dickinson was a very proper guy. He had practiced with Pierce Rohde. I have a very vague recollection of knowing who Pierce Rohde was from the 1952 work that I did with my dad. But I did know that Don Dickinson, he would open all the mail. All of the incoming letters for the Rohde firm would be opened, and he would review every incoming letter, and it would they would put on their stationery address firm, attention writer. Now my dad would look at all of the letters that were outgoing, and he would be leaving it after lunch. He'd come in the morning. None of the letters that we signed would go out that night unless there was really an exception. And they were all put on his secretary's desk. He would come in and he would read every outgoing letter.
Did he edit?
Well, it depended. I mean, I can recall him walking past my office with a letter that was written by somebody in the firm, and he would go into our law library, and if he came back with the letter, all was well. If he came back with a letter and a statute book or a case book, you're going to have to correct yourself.
Something that
Something he'd found.
Let's talk about.
But Bill Sloan was a superb trial lawyer. He was Joe Rail was a superb trial lawyer. Jim Sperling did a lot of abstract examinations for ranches. Mr. Modrell had been a cowboy before he went to, he worked on a ranch up near Las Vegas, and he was very interested in ranching.
What about Mr. McLeod, A.H. McLeod?
Well, Mr. McLeod was,
Tell for the people who don't have the memory,
well, he would.
who was he in relation to your firm?
He worked for my dad. My dad wrote him a letter. He wrote Washington and Lee and asked for, did anybody want to come to New Mexico and practice law? And unfortunately, that was 1929.
Wow.
And he graduated in 1929, and the stock market crashed in October of 29. McLeod worked, he roomed with Donald Moses. They were great friends, Fuzzy Moses, who started the Moses Law Firm.
Well, tell us, for the
McLeod
memory,
was
why Mr. Moses was called Fuzzy.
Well, it's just lack of hair.
Yeah, like a little monk sort of.
But he was a lawyer with Bob Nordhaus. Bob Nordhaus was a graduate of the Yale Law School, graduated in 1935. Was with my dad for a short term, then he started his own practice. He later represented Indian tribes and had a very successful career representing Indian tribes, got a decision that the Jicarilla Indians did not have to pay severance taxes on their oil and gas production in Rio Arriba County. Wrote a book called Teepee or something. I can't think of the exact book.
Mr. McLeod then came out.
But he had to work. He worked part-time. I mean, both Moses and McLeod worked in the district attorney's office. As you know, the district attorney would hire part-time lawyers, but it was not a good time economically during the Depression.
If one heard stories about Mr. McLeod suggesting that he had a rather difficult temperament, would that be accurate? Would that conform to your recollection?
No, he was a little bombastic, but I don't think he ever lost his temper.
Was he a trial lawyer?
Oh yes, he was a superb trial lawyer.
That was.
We would get clients that would come in and say they had been on a jury and watched McLeod and they won. But he was very aggressive in his trial work.
Did you ever try a case with opposing counsel to Joe Rail?
I don't recall one. Russell Moore started to practice. Russell Moore graduated in June of 1957 from the University of New Mexico Law School. And as I say, I graduated in January of '58. Then I went in the Air Force, and I was a JAG officer for a couple of years. When I got back, McLeod had been using Russell to take depositions. Russell was about to, and then a couple of years later, Russell was about to quit the law firm. I could recall meeting with Russell at breakfast, lunch, sometimes saying, "Russell, stay." And his complaint was McLeod wouldn't let him try cases. But McLeod took him to every case. And we didn't charge by the hour. We just charged on work product, time spent in the ballpark. And I said, no, it's going to come. And then McLeod let Russell start to try cases. But because he had 4 or 5 years of second chair experience, he was a superb lawyer right from the very beginning. And then the office work I was doing, we had another lawyer, John Tittman, who was a superb trial lawyer. Tittman was a brilliant, he was absolutely brilliant.
Did you ever have any work experience with Bill Bondurant from Roswell?
No, I knew him, but he was with the Hinkle, Hervey Dow and Hinkle, Post Office Box 10, Roswell, New Mexico. And later your father worked for Hervey Dow and Hinkle, and then they changed the name to Hinkle, Bondurant, Bratton, and Christie. Your father was appointed as a federal judge in February or March of 1964, and I remember Sim Christie told your father that you can't take that job because we've already ordered all the stationery, we've changed the firm, and we don't want to change it
A lot
again.
of letterhead gone to waste.
Yes.
I wondered about Bill Bondurant because when you talked about Mr. Tittman being a scholar, that's the history that I've heard about Mr. Bondurant, is that he would, if he came to Albuquerque, he'd spend an extra day just being in the law library reading law. And I also thought that his practice area was natural resources, but I could be wrong on that.
Well, he was an oil and gas lawyer.
Oh, right, which is different.
He was an oil and gas lawyer, but to spend the day in the law school, I will say this, that my partner, Tim Kelleher, who's 10 years older than I, we had a case in federal court against 2 lawyers from Deming, New Mexico. And they had to come to the law school to do their research. It was an appellate, they lost the case and they appealed to the 10th Circuit. And they had to write their brief in the law school because in Deming, New Mexico, there was no, or was an inadequate law library. So they, and I'll say none, I mean, I don't know what kind of work you'd had, but lawyers from out of state or out of town would have to come up to UNM to work in the law library because they didn't have the resources. Today, with the computerized research, you're just able to do that.
When I did not know that you had practiced in an era before the dreaded hourly rate
Yes.
timesheet.
Yes, the New Mexico State Bar, I still have it. We put out a book, and we had the minimum fee schedule, and we were asked to charge $25 an hour because the bar associations throughout the United States said lawyers were being inadequately compensated, and they needed to go to an hourly rate. Oh. So we had a uniform fee schedule, and I don't recall now the details, but that became the target of the feds. They said that was restraint on trade, antitrust conspiracy, and that sort of thing. And so they backed off. But I still have my minimum fee schedule.
Oh, you have a copy of that?
I have the original.
Oh, we would love to get a copy of that for our history project. Can I follow up with you on that later?
I'm sure that my office would love to get rid of one more book. It's in my personal library.
It takes my breath away that lawyers, you know, how that worm has turned, because my guess is if you ask many active practitioners, the hourly rate has become a yoke, a taskmaster all of its own. We would begin to keep time, and in our office we had a metal pegboard that was probably 17 or 8 inches long, and you had this Reynolds and Reynolds of Salt Lake City sold you these tear sheets, and you would write down the name of the case, the date, what you did, and you would write that down on this tear sheet. You'd take it off. Underneath it would be the carbon copy of just the day and the hours in the case, 4.4, whatever it was. You'd put those in a box. We had green plastic boxes. They'd be alphabetized. Then my secretary would go through that to make up the darn bill. And at first, with the computers, and using the computers, there was some, we were sending our typewritten timesheets into a place in Florida to print it out because we didn't have a local computer that would do that. And then there was a big squawk in the state bars or the lawyers, is this a violation of attorney-client privilege because you're letting this information leave the office? Later, a company in town started to do it, Total Business Services. It was owned by Ken Odell, and they would do it locally. So all firms, not just yours, would use something like this?
Yeah, there was a service, and we gave it to that, and then eventually we had our own computer in the office, our own software.
Well, the pegboard system, would you rip off a different sheet for each matter?
Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
So if you had worked for 5 clients during the day, you'd fill out 5 different
that's
sheets
right.
of that
Yeah,
sort.
that's right.
And then the secretary would just,
Or she'd put them in a
Copy
box.
type.
Yeah, yeah.
that doesn't sound too efficient.
Ken Odell, I think he sold his computer business to Presbyterian Hospital, and his hard.
Wow. It became such, by the time I was practicing, it ruled, the timesheet ruled.
We'd look through
So
a
much.
file. McLeod would look through the file, and he'd sort of look to see how many depositions we'd taken. Then you'd just sort of thumb it and eyeball it, and then you'd grab a price and you'd send the bill.
What about the notion of turnaround? That, for example, you said if you wrote a letter today, it probably wouldn't go out until tomorrow because your father or something.
Well, it'd get delivered the next day.
But secretaries typed, even when I started practicing, there weren't word processors.
No.
Secretaries typed your dictation, in our case. I mean, into a dictaphone as opposed to a stenographer-type secretary. And there just was not as much work flying out.
Well, we had
24/7.
the secretaries took shorthand.
Right.
We didn't have dictated machines at first in our office. You'd bring in the secretary, and my father would actually at times have 2 secretaries. When he was very busy, he'd have one secretary on the right, one secretary on the left. They'd hand him the file, he'd dictate to the one on the left and the one on the right. And then when I started to practice law, he had a Miss Scanzini had been with him since 1917, and she, Dad would dictate to Mrs. Porter. Mrs. Porter would type the letter, and Ilda would proof it that afternoon, give it back to her, Miss Porter, so it would be in final form when Dad came to the office the next morning.
Talk specifically about briefs, and because thinking about that system with briefs and the number of rewrites, at least I do, and edits and whatnot, would have taken forever.
That depended on the lawyer. Some lawyers like David Olmsted could dictate a brief, and he would make notes. And I've worked with David in Santa Fe, and he would make notes, and then he would dictate, and it would come back almost perfect with his dictation. Others couldn't do that. But as far as briefs for your historical project, the New Mexico Supreme Court, you had to file a brief with onion skin carbon copies. But then we went to photocopies, and then the court became dissatisfied with the photocopies because some of the photocopy machines were not very good. And so you had to send a checkup. You'd send your original brief to the New Mexico Supreme Court with a check to cover the copying costs, and they would then make the photocopies and send out to opposing counsel.
But the onion skin system would require an entire rewrite if you move chunks of the brief around.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, that's the way Dad wrote books. Dad wrote books. He would write books at home, and he had bookshelves in his where he wrote much of the time, and then he would cut and paste, and he would thumbtack it, and then he would roll it up in a big scroll, and I would take it out on Rio Grande Boulevard to a former secretary of his that later came back to work for us, and they were the scrolls. But talking about the books and the courthouse security, during World War II, my father used the office of the judge. Judge Neblett was the only federal judge. He was working he generally lived in Santa Fe and held court in Santa Fe. There was only one federal judge for most of the time in those days. And Dad had a key to the federal courthouse. Oh. And he would go down to the federal courthouse and
the one downtown, you mean, in Albuquerque?
Downtown, yeah, at 5th and Gold, and he was writing the books, and I remember during World War II, the General Services Administration told Neblett that they were taking over his office because he didn't need it and they needed it for the war space. And Neblett said, no, they're not going to take my office, I need it. And Dad told us this at dinner. He said, well, Neblett was in this fight with the GSA, and they said, no, you don't need it. We know that you've given a key to the courthouse to some lawyer, and he goes in there and works in the early morning hours. Dad would never write books, history books, at his law office. He always wanted another office. He would borrow an office. And he would write in the early morning hours, then he'd go to breakfast downtown and go to the office. But the GSA said, no, this lawyer has a key to the federal courthouse, and he's working down there, and we want your office. And Neblett said, I said you couldn't have it, and you better not fight with Judge Neblett.
And they never took it.
They never took it.
Tell me what you remember about the rhythm of your dad's work world when you were younger.
I don't remember a whole lot about it because I was totally unaware of the fact that I know that he was leaving early in the morning, and he would often eat breakfast downtown, and when we'd go on a vacation, I know that he would borrow an office and write, and then to get a book in final form, he would take a month off and go to Guaymas, Mexico, take a typewriter and get the book into final form.
In practice, did he come home regularly, 5 to 6?
No.
As opposed to today, where people come
No,
home at all
he
crazy
worked
hours.
until he got it done.
And it seemed to me that, well, that's going to be a poor question. Did he work regularly Saturdays?
Mornings. Downtown, the office was always open until 1 o'clock on Saturday. We closed at 1 o'clock. We opened at 8:30 and closed at 1 on Saturday.
Having known you myself when you were a young lawyer, it was my observation that you worked the 5 days a week and Saturday mornings, and that
That's
was
correct.
just your regular schedule.
That's right.
But I do not recall lawyers in those days, just from my observation of a few people, working routinely till 7, 7:30, 8, or 11 or 12, the way people do now, that generally a lawyer was home for dinner.
No, I would work until, I would work through the dinner hour until I got finished. I was also going to work sometimes at 5:30 in the morning. But I worked with a lawyer by the name of Robert Clark, whose wife was a school teacher, and they had no children. And he wanted to go home and have dinner on time, and I wanted to work through the dinner hour until we finished.
Well, let's remember too, you had 5 children at home.
That's right. But no, my wife put up with all of it.
And we've talked about your 3 who are lawyers. Just to round out the picture of your family, what are your other 2 children doing?
Mark is a graduate of Wharton MBA. For many years, he was CEO of a subsidiary of Mellon Bank, but then it was acquired by Bank of New York. And after a time, they phased that business out completely. He still lives in San Francisco and has worked for an investment firm, but I think he'll be trying to get back into that. He was in transition of securities. And then Julia has a master's degree in psychology, and she's been pretty well a full-time mom. All of my children have at least a master's degree or equivalent.
And 4 of them have remained here in Albuquerque.
4 have.
That's quite a blessing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And unusual for these days. Were there any women in your law school class?
Just a very few.
Who do you remember?
Well, I remember 3 or 4, but I will say this, that one woman that was a little older told me that she had applied to Stanford Law School after World War II, and she got a letter back from Stanford saying, we're not going to, you're qualified, but were saving all of the slots in the law school for returning World War II veterans. And she accepted that. And then later, maybe 5 women, I don't know, out of 150.
And are any of the 3 that you recall going to school with people that practiced then in the local bar?
Well, most of the Stanford graduates that I knew, most of my friends, all stayed in California.
Oh, no, you misunderstood my question. I'm trying to develop your experience or the history of women in the New Mexico bar, you know, the early women we know about.
One of the women in the New Mexico bar was Ann Bingaman.
Right.
And she could not get a job with a law firm as a lawyer. And she went to work for the Modrell law firm as a paralegal. And she was a Stanford Law School graduate. She had a degree from the London School of Economics. She met Jeff Bingaman in law school. They both graduated at Stanford Law School, and married at some point. I know that I met a Stanford Law School graduate in their class in Washington, D.C. one time, who did not know they had dated or were married.
Wow.
He knew them both, but they kept it very close. But getting back to Ann, I asked her, I said, well, did you apply to our firm? And she said, no, I didn't. I said, and I don't know why. I don't know why. But she was hired as a paralegal with the Modrell law firm, and she was working on a case with Joe Rail. And Joe Rail, Ann told me this herself. She said, Joe said, you know, you're a lawyer. Why aren't you a lawyer in this law firm? And he said, well, she told Joe that they wouldn't hire me as a lawyer. He said, they wouldn't hire you as a lawyer? He said, I'll fix that. And so she became a lawyer very shortly thereafter because Joe Rail said she should be a lawyer.
When, in your firm, do you remember the first woman or a few women who worked there?
Well, I remember Meg Davidson was teaching. She had taught at Northern Iowa University, and she had taught English. Her father was a lawyer and a judge in New Jersey, and for some reason she applied to us for a summer job, and she could write, and I know that we hired Meg Davidson. She died several years ago.
So she probably came into your firm around 82 or 83.
I can't remember the date. I couldn't
yeah.
give you the date, but she was, I mean, I could remember the statement that she could write. I mean, she just, as a summer law clerk, she could write.
I'm thinking of, we've talked about Ann Bingaman, Mary Walters. Did you ever have any practice?
She was a secretary in the McAtee, Toulouse, Marchiano, Rudd, and Gallagher firm. And I filed a lawsuit in federal court for a $20,000 collection for an out-of-state company. And David Gallagher was defending the case, and he told me they really had to work on this case because the secretary in their office was married to one of the partners in this partnership that I'd sued, and that was Mary Walters, and she later became a lawyer and then a Supreme Court justice. I will also say this, that Judge Waldo Rogers was the judge, and I can remember standing in front of him when he said, "What's this? This is a collection case. What's a collection case doing in federal court?" Well, it was $3,000. It was the jurisdictional amount to file a lawsuit, and I thought it was a big deal, $20,000, and I filed in federal court, and Rogers didn't like it.
Did Judge Rogers let people know from the bench his opinions in that way?
Yes.
Do you, you mentioned just...
He also, on one of my federal cases, I was defending a narcotic case that was charged with selling heroin. And this was one of these pro bono things. And Judge Walter Rogers called me in one day. I wanted to see me in chambers. And I went into his office, and he said that this guy had complained about 2 lawyers already that would not try to disqualify him. And he said, I didn't think you could disqualify a federal judge, but I had my law clerk research it, and you can. And he said, this guy will want you, I'm going to appoint you. You'll be the 3rd lawyer, and you're it. And he said, and if he wants you to disqualify me, have a try. Good luck, buddy. Well, I don't know that he said buddy,
Yeah.
but he said, good luck. And I'll always remember, because to have tried to disqualify Walter Rogers would have been, the clerk's office would have been astounded when I filed that.
Thinking down the line of federal judges here, can we go a few more questions? I mean, we've been talking for an hour. Are you
No,
still good?
That's fine. I'm fine.
What do you have to say about, or what are your memories of Judge Verl Payne?
Well, Judge Verl Payne was a federal judge from Silver City. He was appointed when there was the vacancy when
Hatch.
I guess Carl Hatch died, and Judge Verl Payne, there were a number of contenders. I've always thought that he was, at the time when you filed an affidavit of disqualification or whatever we called it, you could disqualify every judge in the district. So you didn't have just one judge. If you filed an affidavit, you could disqualify them all. And there was a very, very important will contest going on. They stipulated on Judge Payne to come up to Albuquerque and try that case. And I always thought that, personally, that gave him a real boost. He had never gone to law school. He he had learned law, reading law, as they called it. He had on his bench, there was a 4-volume work on evidence. He didn't use Wigmore on evidence. He had this 4-volume work on on evidence. And I could recall being in court and seeing him look at this book on evidence, and I went back to the office and immediately ordered that for our law library, because I thought, if he thinks that's the law, we're going to get that book in the office right now.
Did he have a reputation as being anything?
He told a federal, we had motion day in those days. Motion days were wonderful because all motions would be heard on a specific day. There may be 15 motions to be heard during the day. I make that figure up because I don't remember. But you all had to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they would call your case. But the point of it is you heard other lawyers argue, like Joe Rail, Real Sloan, McLeod. You'd sit there, you'd hear them argue, and that sort of thing. And there was a Social Security case in which the Social Security Administration had denied benefits to some guy. And the government lawyer from Dallas or someplace was arguing that the administrative law judge was correct. And Payne said, well, he said, I'll tell you this, I'll look at the law you cite, but if there's any way I can find against you, I will. And then he called a recess, and we went out, and this lawyer from Texas was just fuming that the judge was saying that
Yes.
if there was any way I could find against you. I also had a case involving a tax dispute in which a woman had married a man in Los Alamos who had not filed income tax returns for several years. She told him to get with it and file the tax returns. She unfortunately co-signed the tax returns, the joint returns in the later years while they were married, and the federal government assessed her. The insurance, she was a teacher. She had signed up for a retirement for an annuity. pension, and it was said in federal law that that this annuity couldn't be attached, it was safe and that sort of thing. And I got a letter from New York for the insurance company that said, this is very important to us. We have sold all these policies throughout the United States, and if the federal government can garnish her assets to pay this tax liability, we're going to, well, you have to fight it. This is not a case involving a few $1,000s. We want you to go full bore. And in front of Judge Payne, I made the argument that this was a very important case. And Judge Payne said, this is only a $5,000 case or something. And I was trying to convince him how important it was. This is a $5,000 case, I don't care. Well, Ruth Streeter was assistant U.S. attorney, and she was, we settled it for, I think she bent over backwards to help this lady.
So and did you set the precedent that the company was wanting?
We did, well, we did set a precedent because we made a very favorable settlement.
Well.
So Ruth Streeter, incidentally, was the only female in the U.S. Attorney's Office at the time, and when the new federal U.S. Attorney was appointed, he made a courtesy call on Judge Carl Hatch, and they exchanged cordial greetings. Judge Hatch said that he would always work well with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he would ensure that they would keep this relationship up, and they, went through the usual stuff. And as the new U.S. Attorney was leaving, Judge Hatch said, "Oh yes, and one more thing," he said. "I'm highly confident you'll be keeping Miss Streeter as assistant," because they had no tenure. "I'm highly confident you're going to be keeping Miss Streeter on your staff." "Oh yes, Judge, right." So, because at that time, she could have been fired.
Absolutely.
She was the only woman in the office. And there were probably only 5 U.S. attorneys, assistants at the time.
Then that was Judge Hatch.
That was Judge Hatch.
Talk about, I just have
all of this is a lot of legend stories.
But that's the stuff we love. That's the stuff we want. That's what drew me to this project, in essence. We're also capturing, and I think we did in your earlier interview, just your personal trajectory as an attorney. And but I am really interested in your interview and in others in these anecdotes, because they're going to, they're little nuggets of gold that just inform the climate and as it developed in New Mexico. Which brings me to 2 other lawyers I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned them and because they were sort of legendary. What do you remember, or did you ever have any experience with Billy Marchiondo? I know his practice was primarily criminal, but
yes.
Talk about Billy.
Well, Billy Marchiondo was a very hard-hitting lawyer. His word was his bond. He tried to hold me in contempt of court one time because I hadn't done something that he thought I was in violation of an order that he'd prepared, which I hadn't, but he probably had intended that I do something, but he just didn't get it done. But I got even with Billy Marchiondo later when he filed a quiet title suit over uranium property in Grants. And my father had had a quiet title suit years before, and he wanted to see the file. And I said, "No, Billy, you can't see it. It's attorney-client privilege." And at that time, he said, "Well, I want to see it." So he wanted to take my deposition. So I showed up with John Tittman in my firm as my counsel, and John Tittman objected. It was attorney-client privilege, and he said he was going to go to court. The judge was Frank Zinn in Gallup, so we had to go to Gallup for this hearing. And the judge Zinn said, "Do you have?" Well, he said, "Let me look at the file. Do you have the file with you?" And I said, "Yes." So I handed it to him, and he said he'd look at it and decide. He looked at it. He said, "Well, there's nothing in it. It's been stripped." I said, "Yes, I know that." Billy, you made a trip over here. But after that, we became good friends.
There's nothing in the file.
But I wouldn't tell him that.
What about but I was interested to hear you say that he was a,
But he also, no, this isn't, this, when Billy Marchiano got cancer and was dying, he was living alone, he'd been divorced, and Nick Kappinson, who had bought at public auction, the bankruptcy auction, Doug Vaughn's home, a big home.
oh, I didn't know Capnison bought that.
He bought that home, and I went to see Billy Marchiano primarily because another friend of ours wanted to see him. And I had to call Nick Kappinson to find out how to get there. But Nick had him in a room right off the main entrance. He was letting Billy Marchiano live in his home. He had, and I think that that speaks very well for Nick Kappinson. I also know that, or understand that a fellow that belonged to the Albuquerque Country Club and had fallen on hard times, had to move into an apartment. Billy was paying his rent.
That's very touching.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, because I know that the Marchiando family was from the Raton area, and that a number of the Greek,
Italian.
The
Italians.
the Capnisons and
Well, he's Greek. Kappinson is Greek.
yeah. But the other, who am I thinking? Like Malouf and there
They're
were
Lebanese.
a group of families in that mining community that I might have included the Capnisons.
The Maloufs, no, the Kappinsons are from here.
Okay.
The Kappinsons had a restaurant in the 100 block of South 4th Street. The P&K Cafe was Nick Kappinson's father's.
Oh, I
Little
see.
hole in the
Okay.
wall. The Maloufs came from Las Vegas, New Mexico. They were Lebanese.
Right.
Still are Lebanese.
So I was, yeah, I was blending Capnison in with them. What about, if anything, you remember about Jim Toulouse? I don't know how you could have practiced law and not
Well,
run
Jim
across him.
Toulouse, I was defending the case one time, and he gave me a beautiful leather-bound volume of photos and letters and all that sort of thing. And after we settled the case, he wanted the leather binder back.
What was that apropos of history or?
Oh no, it was to show the decedent. It was a death case.
Oh,
death
I
case.
see.
But you know what a great guy this guy had been. It was a case up from Las Vegas, New Mexico.
I
And
see.
there were the photos of the family and letters of. He was actually a Presbyterian minister that had died in this accident.
And when the trial was over,
Well, we didn't have a trial. We settled it.
when the settlement was over, he wanted his
No,
binder back.
he wanted the folder back.
I don't really remember what kind of practice, not that, like, as you point out,
Well, he was
everyone's
a
kind of
partner with
general.
Pete McAtee. It was McAtee, Toulouse, Marchiano, Rudd, and Gallagher at one time. And he, as far as I knew him, he was a plaintiff's lawyer.
That's what I understood too. And that name, although I'm not familiar with all of them, has to me more of a connotation of sort of a run and gun, rough and tumble kind of practice, but bare knuckles practice, I guess I would say.
No, I don't know.
That wasn't your
You just do what you do what you do to make a living.
and
Represent your clients well.
and these gentlemen did that.
I mean, the insurance guys don't want to pay the claim. You know, the guys that sell insurance policies don't pay the claims. It goes to a different department.
Well, I want to ask you these final kind of wrap-up questions. And you're going to be reluctant to answer this, I know, but what would you consider to be your greatest contribution to the law in New Mexico or in specific?
Well, before we leave this, you know, one of the premier lawyers is Robert Botts. That you haven't mentioned him, but he
yes.
certainly was
Mr. Botts.
absolutely. He represented the Albuquerque public school system for many, many years, and his charges were so modest that after he retired, they learned what lawyers charged.
That was quite a shock. And was he not a second generation? Wasn't his father a practicing lawyer as well?
Clarence Botts, yeah, his father was Clarence Botts,
And Robert Botts would have been about your dad's generation, right?
a little younger,
Yeah.
probably born in about 1900.
And my understanding about his work for the Albuquerque Public Schools was that it was a community service in his mind. It
Well,
was
I
not
think so, yeah.
a business. What kind of practice did Mr. Botts have outside of that? Was he a,
Probably making wills and probate and real estate. You know, same thing as Gino Matucci did, you know, represented a lot of the Italian families. Gino Matucci was a premier lawyer.
and there have been Matusi sprinkled about
Yes,
the law here
Paul
for many
was
years.
Paul was son of his was a lawyer, and and then there's a couple other a nephew.
Okay, now that was a nice pivot, but back to your most significant contribution.
I don't have any significant contributions.
Would you have, yeah, there's another question that in our, bank that asks if you feel that you left a legacy to the profession. I bet you're going to say no.
No,
Yeah, well, except your children who are all contributing in one way or the other.
no.
Other than cases you've talked about, are there cases that stand out to you as being particularly interesting or particularly significant that really you remember they were important to you or they were particularly meaningful?
Well, one of the more major cases John Tippman tried. I was second chair, but I actually did a lot of the preparation. Was a libel case against the Albuquerque Tribune, the evening newspaper, and that was a 10-day jury trial.
Who was the plaintiff?
It's a fellow by the name of William Rockefeller. He had been city purchasing agent for the city of Albuquerque, and it was alleged that he had sold equipment, that had kept the money, that sort of thing. But there have been a lot of memories of not significant cases. I had a very interesting case that I had won in federal court, and it was appealed by the plaintiff to the 10th Circuit. The 10th Circuit, that oral argument was being held in Oklahoma City, which was unusual. I went over on the morning newspaper, morning plane. I was told you always go to the clerk's office and tell the clerk's office that you're going to be in the library in the afternoon to prepare your last minute oral argument. I knew the case anyway. I mean, I didn't have to prepare it. But I went there, and the clerk's office said, well, Mr. Kelleher, that case was for this morning. And I said, what? And I'm reaching for my briefcase. And then she laughed and said, well, the court, or then she had said, we set it for, yes, it was set for tomorrow, but we changed it for today. It was this morning. And, you know, my heart's about to drop off, and she laughed, and she said, we called your office, talked to your secretary, we called the plaintiff's office. He's on his way here. We looked in our file, and although the court had changed it, we forgot to notify you. I thought that's very funny, you know. And then my first 10th Circuit argument, my cousin Tim had tried the case. I wrote the brief. I was with him. And we went to, there was two defendants. One was Jim Ritchie, who was a premier defense lawyer in the Rhodey firm. And we got there. Tim Kelleher, well, there was a cross appeal. So Tim Kelleher told the Judge Murrah, who was the chief judge of the 10th Circuit Court, that we would split our time, that he would take the appellee side, and I was going to take the appellate on the counterclaim. And Judge Murrah says, I don't like that at all. He said, I don't like lawyers splitting an argument. This young man would argue the entire case. Well, I hadn't prepared to argue the entire case. I had sat through the trial. I had written the brief. Then Jim Ritchie got up and he said to Judge Murrah, Your Honor, this is a diversity case, and under the rule of whatever it is, New Mexico law would apply. And the judge says, I know all about that. Don't get up here and tell the court about that case. He said, get with it. And then I got up and I had to argue this case, and I had no notes, had never prepared for it. I argued the case. And then the judge did ask Tim Kelleher, do you have anything else to say? No, he said he covered it. And that was the judge who had the federal courthouse blowing up in Oklahoma City. But he was pretty cantankerous at those days.
Did you win?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, so you did know the case.
Yes, I did.
Words of wisdom to young lawyers. Say you were sitting in your office and a couple of first-year lawyers came in, or you went out to lunch with them. What would you be inclined to say?
Read what you've written before you sign it. Pay attention. Be on time. Return phone calls. Be honest. And don't do anything that you don't want to appear in the front page of the Albuquerque Journal in the morning.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You betcha.